Eran in Israel. Thanks for waiting. You want to talk about apophatic theology? Welcome.
Hi, welcome. Glad that you're healthy.
Thank you.
In a framework of a debate that an argument between me as an atheist and the religious side, a religious person, the question that I ask is, how do you define your God? And the religious person answers, well, I define God by not defining him, by saying, by giving negative attributes. And that's the idea of this theology. And
can you give an example?
Question. Yeah, of course I can give an example. For example, the religious person says, well, God doesn't have a body. He doesn't have a form. He's not cruel. He's not evil. He's not in the universe. And I ask, well, what is he then? What positive thing can you say about him? And the question is, how do I tackle this? Their answer, their so-called definition. When I ask for a definition, they're not giving actually a definition. How do I tackle that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think you already realized and hit on the biggest problems here. One is that it's a lie to say that they can define God in entirely negative characteristics, because in order to say what God isn't, you need to know what God is. And the first thing is that they think God exists, which is a positive statement, not a negative one. And they can frame that as, well, God doesn't not exist. And then the answer is, how do you know that? And they can say, well, God's not cruel. How do you know that? God's not evil. How do you know that? And the bigger problem here is that they could be listing all the things that God's not forever, and we would have no better understanding of what it is that's talked about. God's not red. God's not blue. God's not acidic. God's not base. God's not electrically charged. God's not electrically charged on Mondays. God's not electrically charged on Tuesdays. God's not electrically charged on alternate Wednesdays. God's not electrically charged on Thursdays. There's an infinite series of things that they would have to go through. And I realize I'm screwing up by using infinity as almost a quantity. Basically, there's no end to the things that they could potentially list in a dynamic and changing universe that God isn't. And so if they can't tell you what God is, then they have not presented a subject for you to address, and they are avoiding debate.
Yeah,
exactly. Like it seems like you're taking the right approach, asking what the definition, like what God essentially they're asking about or they're talking about, and they are dodging the question by not answering it, right? And so, like Matt said, that's meaningless. Like they're telling you things that God isn't. It's like, well, I didn't ask what God isn't. I asked what God is.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that they say is central to the Judaism.
This apophatic theology, I mean, it goes back to the Greeks, and I hadn't actually heard this term before your call. I'd heard it as negative theology before, and actually negative reasoning, to try to define something in terms of what it's not. We don't do that by and large. If somebody says, hey, what's cancer? We don't say, well, it's not athlete's foot. It's not fungal. It's not this. It's not that. We don't go through that stuff like that. And it's absurd that when it comes to the biggest question out there about whether or not there's a God, one of the things that would be one of the most important things to know, were it to be true, at least under some various versions of theology, that's where we see this. Well, let's try to argue or define things in terms of what it's not. Well, I'm going to define their arguments in terms of what they're not. They're not sensible. They're not rational. They're not evidence-based. They're not useful. They're not informative. You could do all that in response to their arguments.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could use these negative descriptors, or someone could use these negative descriptors, and they could be useful, but only in a context where you have something positive already there, right? You could say MD is a human who is not female, right? And that tells you something about me, right? But you have to have a subject or a context to start with. before it has any use.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they are refusing to do. They're refusing to start somewhere.
I hope that helps, and I appreciate the call and the thought, and thank you for waiting patiently while we got to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.